Picture yourself 13,000 years ago. There are no cities, no farms, no stores stocked with food. Your world is a limestone cave in what will one day become Israel, surrounded by a small band of hunter-gatherers who depend on one another for survival. Every meal has to be found, every day is uncertain, and wasting food is a luxury no one can afford. After hours of gathering wild grain, someone notices that a forgotten batch left inside a stone mortar has changed. It has become damp. Tiny bubbles cling to the surface. A strange, sour aroma rises into the air. By every instinct that has kept your ancestors alive for thousands of generations, this should be a warning. Food that changes unexpectedly is food to avoid. Yet someone does the unimaginable. Instead of throwing it away, they lift it to their lips and drink. That single decision, reckless, curious, and completely impossible to predict, may have become one of the most important moments in human history. Because what they tasted was almost certainly alcohol. And from that moment onward, fermented drinks would become woven into nearly every civilization on Earth, shaping rituals, religions, celebrations, economies, and perhaps even the birth of agriculture itself. So when did ancient humans first start drinking alcohol? Was it a lucky accident made by desperate hunter-gatherers? Or was our relationship with alcohol already millions of years in the making before the first human ever existed? The answer is far older than the oldest brewery, older than farming, older than civilization, and even older than our own species. To understand why humans eventually learned to brew beer and ferment wine, we first have to leave caves behind and journey into a tropical forest 10 million years ago, where alcohol already existed without breweries, vineyards, or even humans. Wherever ripe fruit split open or fell to the forest floor, wild yeasts feeding on its sugars naturally converted them into ethanol. Fermentation was never a human invention. It was one of nature's countless chemical processes, quietly unfolding for millions of years before anyone was around to notice. For our ancient primate ancestors, this wasn't an occasional curiosity. Fruit was one of their most important food sources, and the ripest fruit often carried the faint scent of fermentation. Rather than signaling danger, that smell pointed toward an easy reward. The sweetest fruit contained the most energy, making it worth finding before another hungry animal did. Over millions of years, following that aroma became an advantage in the relentless competition for calories. That evolutionary pressure left its mark inside our bodies. Humans and our closest primate relatives possess a remarkably efficient enzyme known as alcohol dehydrogenase 4, or ADH4. Its job is to break down ethanol before it can build up to dangerous levels. What makes this remarkable is its age. Genetic evidence suggests that a more effective version of this enzyme appeared around 10 million years ago. Millions of years before the first members of the human lineage existed, evolution was preparing our ancestors to process alcohol long before anyone intentionally made it. This discovery inspired evolutionary biologist Robert Dudley to propose what he famously called the drunken monkey hypothesis. His idea was surprisingly simple. Primates that were naturally attracted to the scent of lightly fermented fruit found more ripe food, consumed more calories, survived more often, and ultimately produced more offspring. Across countless generations, natural selection gradually favored individuals whose brains associated the smell of ethanol with nutritional opportunity rather than danger. Modern research offers remarkable support for this idea. Scientists studying wild black-handed spider monkeys in Panama found that the fruit they deliberately selected frequently contained between 1 and 2% alcohol from natural fermentation. Even more convincing, chemical analysis of the monkey's urine confirmed they were actively metabolizing ethanol. Similar studies of wild chimpanzees in Côte d'Ivoire suggest their everyday fruit diet can expose them to the equivalent of 1 or 2 alcoholic drinks by human standards, all without intentionally seeking intoxication. Long before humans learned to brew beer or ferment wine, evolution had already introduced our ancestors to alcohol. Our relationship with it did not begin in a village or a cave. It began deep in the prehistoric forest, written into our biology long before it became part of our culture. Evolution had prepared the stage, but biology alone could never create civilization. For millions of years, our ancestors consumed tiny amounts of alcohol without understanding what it was. They followed the smell of ripe fruit because evolution rewarded them for doing so, not because they recognized the invisible process unfolding inside it. At some point, however, that passive relationship changed forever. Instead of merely discovering fermentation in nature, humans learned they could make it happen. That leap demanded something entirely new. It required careful observation, memory, and curiosity. Someone had to notice that soaked grain behaved differently after a few days. Someone had to remember the result, repeat the process, and realize it was not a random accident, but something that could be recreated. In many ways, this was one of humanity's earliest scientific experiments. The oldest confirmed evidence of that experiment comes from Raqefet Cave, nestled in the hills of present-day Israel. Around 13,000 years ago, the cave served as a burial site for the Natufians, a remarkably sophisticated community of semi-sedentary hunter-gatherers. These were not wandering survivors scraping by from one meal to the next. They buried their dead with care, formed long-lasting settlements, and even maintained close relationships with dogs long before agriculture reshaped human society. Inside the cave, archaeologists uncovered large stone mortars, still containing microscopic traces of ancient plant material. When researchers analyzed the residue, they found unmistakable evidence of brewing. The Natufians had processed wild wheat and barley through several deliberate stages. The grains were first soaked until they began to germinate, converting their stored starches into sugars. They were then mashed and heated before being left to ferment naturally as wild yeast floating through the air transformed those sugars into alcohol. This was not spoiled food. It was a carefully controlled process that produced beer thousands of years before the first farms appeared. Even more revealing was where the beer had been made. The brewing took place inside a burial cave, suggesting it was prepared not for everyday refreshment but for funeral ceremonies honoring the dead. From its earliest archaeological appearance, alcohol was already connected to ritual, memory, and community, rather than simple intoxication. This discovery has transformed how archaeologists view hunter-gatherers. The Natufians were not primitive people stumbling through prehistory. They experimented, planned ahead, mastered surprisingly complex food technology, and invested enormous effort into ceremonies that brought their communities together. Long before cities rose or crops filled cultivated fields, humans were already using fermentation to express something deeply human: the desire to remember, to celebrate, and to give meaning to life's most important moments. If the Natufians were already brewing beer before anyone had planted a field, an obvious question follows. Where did all that grain come from? Gathering wild wheat and barley was slow, unpredictable work. Entire landscapes had to be searched, harvests varied from season to season, and nature decided how much food would be available. Brewing under those conditions demanded an extraordinary investment of time and effort. So why would hunter-gatherers keep doing it? That question lies at the center of one of archaeology's most fascinating debates, known as the beer before bread hypothesis. Proposed most prominently by archaeologist Brian Hayden, the idea turns one of history's biggest assumptions upside down. We usually imagine that humans settled down to grow crops because they needed bread. According to this alternative view, however, bread may not have been the only or even the first motivation. The desire to produce beer reliably could have encouraged people to cultivate grain long before agriculture became the foundation of civilization. To appreciate how radical that idea is, consider what settling down actually meant. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans survived by moving across the landscape, following migrating animals and seasonal plants. Mobility was one of our greatest strengths. Choosing to remain in one place meant giving up that flexibility. It meant clearing land, protecting crops, waiting months for harvests, and risking everything if drought, pests, or bad weather destroyed the year's food supply. Farming was not an obvious improvement. At first, it was an enormous gamble. Supporters of the beer hypothesis argue that fermented grain offered rewards worth taking that risk. Beer was rich in calories, easier to store than fresh food, and naturally safer to drink than untreated water in many environments. More importantly, it brought people together. A reliable supply of beer could transform seasonal gatherings into large communal feasts, strengthen alliances between families, honor ancestors, and reinforce shared traditions. Those social benefits may have been powerful enough to justify investing in cultivated grain. Not everyone agrees. Many archaeologists maintain that bread and other staple foods came first, with brewing developing later as a natural extension of grain processing. The evidence can support multiple interpretations, and no single discovery has settled the argument beyond doubt. Yet, the Natufian brewery changed the conversation forever. It demonstrated that humans were intentionally making beer before fully developed agriculture existed. Whether beer inspired farming or simply accompanied it, one conclusion is now difficult to escape. Fermentation was not a luxury added after civilization emerged. It was already helping shape the choices that would eventually make civilization possible. As archaeologists uncovered more evidence from different parts of the world, another remarkable pattern began to emerge. The Natufians were not an isolated exception. Thousands of years after their burial feasts in Raqefet Cave, entirely different societies, separated by vast distances, different climates, and no known contact with one another, were arriving at the same discovery. Again and again, humans learned how to transform ordinary plants into extraordinary drinks. It was as though fermentation was a puzzle every civilization was destined to solve. One of the earliest examples comes from Jiahu, a Neolithic settlement in China's Yellow River Valley, dating back roughly 9,000 years. When scientists analyzed residues preserved inside ancient pottery vessels, they identified a remarkably sophisticated fermented beverage made from rice, honey, and fruit, including hawthorn. Rather than relying on a single ingredient, these early brewers combined several natural sources of sugar to create what could fairly be described as one of the world's first mixed alcoholic drinks. Long before written recipes existed, they were already experimenting with flavor, ingredients, and fermentation techniques. At nearly the same time, another tradition was taking shape thousands of miles away in the South Caucasus. In what is now the country of Georgia, archaeologists discovered large clay vessels containing chemical traces of fermented grapes dating back around 8,000 years. These jars represent the oldest confirmed evidence of wine production ever found. Even today, many Georgian winemakers continue using large earthen vessels buried underground, preserving a tradition whose roots stretch back to the very beginnings of human civilization. Across East Asia, fermentation continued to evolve in its own distinctive direction. Archaeological discoveries show that early brewers developed techniques using naturally occurring molds to break down starches before fermentation began. This innovation became the foundation for countless traditional drinks, influencing beverages that are still produced across China, Japan, and Korea thousands of years later. The methods have changed remarkably little, creating one of the longest continuous brewing traditions on Earth. The most astonishing part of this story is that none of these cultures appear to have learned fermentation from one another. The people of ancient China, the early winemakers of Georgia, and the hunter-gatherers of the eastern Mediterranean developed their techniques independently, guided only by observation, patience, and curiosity. Faced with grain, fruit, or honey, humans repeatedly reached the same conclusion. If nature could transform these foods on its own, perhaps they could guide the process themselves. That remarkable convergence suggests fermentation was far more than a fortunate accident. It reveals something deeply human, a universal curiosity to understand nature's hidden processes and, once understood, to harness them in ways that would forever change the course of our history. As fermentation spread across the ancient world, alcohol stopped being simply a remarkable discovery and became something far more powerful. It evolved into a force that shaped economies, reinforced political authority, strengthened religious traditions, and organized entire societies. No civilization demonstrates this transformation more clearly than Mesopotamia, the fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, often called the cradle of civilization itself. By around 3500 BCE, brewing had become an established craft throughout the region. But the Mesopotamians did more than make beer. They built their society around it. Clay tablets covered with some of humanity's earliest writing reveal detailed records of beer distributions to workers. Laborers digging canals, constructing temples, or maintaining irrigation systems did not simply receive food for their efforts. They were paid with measured daily rations of beer. It was nutritious, relatively safe to drink, and valuable enough to function as part of the economic system. Long before coins circulated through marketplaces, beer had become a practical form of compensation. its importance extended beyond the workplace into the spiritual world. The Sumerians worshipped a brewing goddess named Ninkasi, whose name roughly translates as the lady who fills the mouth. Around 1800 BCE, they composed the famous Hymn to Ninkasi, a religious poem celebrating her divine gift. Hidden within its verses is something extraordinary, a detailed description of the brewing process itself. The hymn explains how grain was malted, baked into bread, soaked, fermented, and transformed into beer. It served not only as an act of worship, but also as a remarkably effective way of preserving technical knowledge across generations. As Mesopotamian civilization expanded, alcohol became important enough to require legal protection. The famous Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest surviving collections of written laws, contains regulations governing taverns, pricing, and the quality of beer. Tavern keepers who cheated customers or watered down their product faced severe punishment. Thousands of years before modern consumer protection laws, governments were already policing the quality of alcoholic beverages. Ancient Egypt followed a remarkably similar path. Beer formed the daily foundation of life for ordinary workers, including those who built the pyramids. Brewed mainly from emmer wheat, it provided calories, hydration, and a safer alternative to untreated river water. Wine, meanwhile, became the drink of royalty and the priesthood, reserved for ceremonies, offerings, and burial chambers prepared for the afterlife. Across both civilizations, alcohol had become far more than a drink. It connected religion with government, labor with compensation, medicine with nutrition, and ordinary people with the institutions that held society together. By the time the world's first great civilizations emerged, fermentation was no longer shaping individual lives. It had become one of the invisible foundations upon which civilization itself was built. Step back and look at the archaeological record as a whole, and one pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The earliest evidence of alcohol almost never appears in ordinary kitchens or everyday meals. Instead, it consistently emerges in places where humans were trying to make sense of life's greatest mysteries. Burial caves, temple complexes, ceremonial feasts, and sacred gatherings all preserve traces of fermented drinks, suggesting that alcohol was valued for far more than its intoxicating effects. The Natufians brewed beer to accompany the burial of their dead. The Sumerians dedicated an entire goddess to brewing and treated beer as a divine gift. In Egypt, wine was sealed inside royal tombs so that pharaohs could carry it into the afterlife, while beer was offered to both gods and worshippers during religious festivals. Similar patterns appear across ancient China, where fermented beverages accompanied burial rituals and ceremonial occasions. Why does this happen so consistently across cultures that never met one another? Perhaps because fermentation did something no ordinary food could. It gathered people together, marked important transitions, and briefly altered the way they experienced the world. Whether interpreted as communion with the divine, a way of honoring ancestors, or simply a powerful tool for strengthening social bonds, alcohol became part of the rituals that defined human communities. From the very beginning, humans did not reserve fermentation for ordinary days. They brought it out for the moments that mattered most, when welcoming new life, mourning the dead, celebrating the harvest, or reaffirming the beliefs that held their societies together. Long before it became a drink of recreation, alcohol had already become a language of ritual, memory, and shared human experience. When you trace the story back to its beginning, it becomes clear that humanity never truly invented alcohol. Nature did. Long before our ancestors shaped stone tools or painted cave walls, fermenting fruit was already scattered across prehistoric forests. Around 10 million years ago, evolution quietly prepared our bodies to recognize it, process it, and even seek it out. Millions of years later, a group of hunter-gatherers standing inside a cave transformed that ancient biological relationship into something entirely new by brewing the first known beer with purpose. From there, the story accelerated. Fermentation spread across continents, inspired rituals, strengthened communities, influenced the rise of agriculture, and became woven into the economies, religions, and laws of the world's first civilizations. What began as a natural chemical process eventually became one of the invisible threads connecting human societies across time. The next time you hold a glass of beer, wine, or any fermented drink, you're holding far more than a beverage. You're holding the latest chapter in a story that stretches from monkeys searching for ripe fruit beneath tropical trees to curious hunter-gatherers experimenting with wild grain, and finally to the civilizations that built the foundations of the modern world. Perhaps that's the most remarkable lesson of all. Human history has never advanced through strength alone. Again and again, it has moved forward because someone looked at something strange, asked a question no one else had asked, and dared to discover what would happen next. Curiosity, just like fermentation, has always had the power to transform the ordinary into something extraordinary.